Thanks again. Yeah, me again. I apologize. For this presentation, I'm going to be actually going over some work that a new PhD in my lab has been focusing on, Lucas Peng. He's done a great job towards answering some of these questions about what the future looks like for us with regards to mountain pine beetle. And so I'm going to be talking to you about sort of what we think will be going forward, where we are currently with the state of mountain pine beetle, and perhaps some of the management implications that they offer up. All right, a little bit of an outline. I have to establish context, and to do this, I'm going to have to go through a bit of mountain pine beetle dynamics, but very briefly. And I'll have to show you sort of the state of things insofar as the invasion has occurred, especially here in Alberta. Both of these bits and pieces you've seen already, but I'm just going to go over them anyways, just so we have them fresh in our brains to bring into the context of the remainder of the presentation. And then the real focus of this presentation is all about the outbreaks themselves, because they're not forever. Right? The mountain pine beetle is busy killing large diameter trees, but what happens when it's done? Right? There is a limited supply no matter where you happen to be, and when it's finished, something has to happen to the beetle. So the question is, what goes on afterwards? Does it change what it does? Does it go extinct? These are questions that we have to deal with. And in fact, it doesn't necessarily go locally extinct. It actually reverts to what I call the endemic phase, and I'll talk about a little bit of what that means in a moment. So based upon the preceding information, we're going to ask whether or not we can predict where endemic mountain pine beetles or post-collapse beetles might be across the habitat. A little bit of the bits and pieces of the nuts and bolts in terms of data generation and modeling. It's less of a heavy lift on the modeling side, more of a GIS exercise, but you'll see how straightforward that is in a moment. And then we'll talk about how we project where we expect to find endemic beetles, the habitats they're occupying after populations collapse. I'm going to make a comparison between British Columbia and Alberta because the two jurisdictions are in different sort of states of being with regards to the mountain pine beetle outbreak, and they provide us with some really interesting comparisons. So we'll talk about what BC has gone through, what Alberta has gone through and is currently experiencing, and then we'll use those sorts of as points of comparison because they give us or inform us in terms of how we might actually consider moving forward by way of management. And then, of course, those implications before we wrap it up with an idea of a few future directions, which Lucas will be working on, and some conclusions. Okay. Mountain pine beetle dynamics. Mark alluded to the fact that this is a complex beastie, and it is. It's a really interesting one with all kinds of crazy nonlinear sorts of dynamics. But really, it's characterized in a nutshell as being an eruptive threshold limited species. Now, this is a label that we've come up with recently that is actually informed by the dynamics themselves. Essentially, this is an insect, an animal that has two distinct population states. One that you're all familiar with, where it's out there killing the big trees and its numbers are growing and spreading. That's the epidemic phase. Beetles in that context love the biggest trees they can find, and when they attack them, they overwhelm them through cooperative mass attacks, and in doing so generate even larger numbers, if possible, in terms of positive feedbacks, and those populations build and spread. And ultimately, you wind up with landscapes that can look like this. But the interesting thing is that these epidemic states are transient, as I mentioned a moment ago, because they're rare and they're ephemeral and they come and they go with the supply of host trees. When they're finished, they have to do something different, and this is the endemic phase. Now, the endemic phase is a really interesting one. I refer to it as being normative because, in fact, this is the normal state of being for mountain pine beetle. In this state, these are beetles that do something entirely different. They actually preferentially attack trees that are suppressed and have impaired vigor, and hence are less defensive. Now, what's interesting is, I don't know how many of you remember a PhD student of mine, Jordan Burke, who unfortunately passed away, but he did some wonderful research where he found that endemic beetles, so beetles that are effectively reared largely by themselves without actually having any knowledge of the size of the population in which they exist, actually will behave endemically and avoid defensively vigorous trees. Whereas you can take those very same beetles and mix them up in a large log with a whole bunch of other beetles, and the offspring produced from them become epidemic. So there's probably something epigenetic in terms of gene switching on and off that ultimately lead to this epidemic versus endemic behavior. So it's not just an observational thing. This is a real thing that the beetle actually goes through. So in the endemic phase, they're doing something really different. Their threshold, of course, is an alley threshold in the sense that there is a threshold number of beetles before this switch occurs, and they become epidemic beetles. And below that threshold number, they remain endemic. And as I said, this is a persistent normative state. The important point to make from all of this, though, is that this normative state of being tells you where the beetles might be. It also gives you an idea of where the source of your next local outbreak might arise, because it's these beetles that ultimately, potentially, can build their numbers past that threshold, and having built past that threshold, switch their behaviors and become epidemic. So that's the dynamics. Let's talk about the state of the invasion. It's a big one. I mean, as you know, it's everywhere. We've actually coined the term hyperepidemic, and it's getting a bit of traction in a recent publication. Mortality of about 60% of the large diameter trees across roughly 18 million hectares. In British Columbia, the populations have collapsed. If you were to walk into central British Columbia forests pretty much on any given day and dig around looking for a mountain pine beetle, I defy you to find one. I have gone and looked. They're done, and they're really hard to find. Here in Alberta, in decline, and I did mention that decline is in some way and part due to the efforts on the part of Alberta forestry people that have been working hard in industry to actually mitigate the spread of the beetle by removing attack trees. So, following this epidemic collapse, the question is, if the beetles are returning to the endemic state, are they in a place where we can find them, or are they going locally extinct? So our question then is whether or not we can actually define what makes an endemic habitat, and if we can do so, can we use that to predict where the future outbreaks might arise? So what we've done here is we've taken a simple metric that is relatively easy to define, the stand density index. And this is work that was done initially by Stan Picorni in my lab. Effectively, this is a common silvicultural metric that speaks to inter-tree competition. Well, inter-tree competition leads to self-thinning. Self-thinning leads to a supply of suppressed trees. Suppressed trees themselves, we know well, are defensively impaired and tend to be preferred by these endemic mountain pine beetles. What we've found is that by measuring stand density index, we can actually have a reasonably good prediction of the number of trees in any given habitat, any given stand, that are susceptible to an endemic population, and hence habitat quality to endemic populations of beetles. These are the data that we're basing this on. This is a relationship that Stan established by surveying populations and stands across in a massive transect from BC through Alberta, and effectively surveyed these stands to actually quantify the amount of habitat and the number of trees that are susceptible to an endemic mountain pine beetle population. And you can see there's a pretty strong positive relationship with the stand density index. The interesting thing is that for lodgepole pine, according to the silviculturalists, this aspect of self-thinning is quite common and actually will persist for as much as 150 years through stand development. So this means that lodgepole pine stands going through a process of self-thinning can provide a pretty consistent supply of suppressed trees just to keep background populations of bark beetles going. And this is not just mountain pine beetle, this would be all the various species that Nadir talked about a moment ago. So we're proposing here that we can use SDI as a functional predictor of the available endemic habitat. So can we actually look at this over landscape? Is there a way that we can actually examine the availability of this post-outbreak to get an idea of where those beetles might be after the populations collapse? Well, the answer to that is yes, and what we've done is we've begun with these vegetation inventories, the VRI from BC or the AVI in Alberta. And of course, these are data sets that are collected periodically. We've begun with the most recent one, and we've used the metrics included in these inventories to begin calculating SDI. So we actually predicted SDI using general additive models. And we took them and we validated them against permanent sample plots available both in BC and Alberta, just to be sure that these things are giving us some reasonable predictive power. We decided to go with a conservative threshold of 750. I mean, the SDI is a unitless number, but you can remember from that previous graph that 750 is about the point at which we started seeing a real increase in the availability of endemic susceptible trees in any given stand. That is the formula for calculating stand density index. It was developed by Reineke in the 1930s. So we take that and we apply it to a vegetation resource inventory that allows us then to start considering the stand density index measure associated with each polygon. And of course, from that, we've done our validation to see what we've got in terms of predictive power. And for the most part, these are actually predicting quite well, but I'll come back to that as we get closer to the end of the talk. So this gives us the opportunity to begin projecting the availability of endemic suitable habitat over landscapes that have been done over by mountain pine beetle. And what we assume here is that the outbreak extent, so any outbreak that has occurred and spread and covered a significant source of real estate or chunk of real estate, is viable post-collapse to have a persistent endemic population remaining. So what we've done here is we've taken BC and Alberta survey data and summed all of the locations of mountain pine beetle through from 98 to 2021 and assumed that where they all occurred remain as viable habitat for any persistent endemic populations post-collapse. We've taken that extent and we combined that with our threshold SDI of 750 to predict endemic mountain pine beetle occupation. So effectively, we use aerial overview surveys, such as what you'll see here from BC, as well as the heli GPS stuff done by Alberta, and effectively combine that with SDI now to have a measure of not only where the potential habitat is, but that habitat that is occupied by the endemic beetles themselves. So let's look at mountain pine beetle in British Columbia. And I bet you can't quite see on that screen down there, which is unfortunate, but I'll populate with some colors that you can see that are contrasty enough. But essentially, you're looking at the habitat occupied by pine. And the first thing that you'll notice right off the top is that pre-outbreak, there was lots of it. In fact, about 31 million hectares or well over 2 million polygons of pine that could have been used by mountain pine beetle. If we apply our SDI threshold to this based upon the current vegetation resource inventory, you'll notice immediately there's a whole bunch less of that's available for mountain pine beetle in the endemic state. In fact, of all of that pine remaining, only about 1.2 million hectares will qualify as being viable habitat for endemic mountain pine beetle. So essentially, this is an indication that mountain pine beetle has pretty much eaten itself out of house and home. Less than 4% of the pre-outbreak pine is predicted to be suitable for any endemic persistent mountain pine beetle. The hyper-epidemic has really beetle-proofed these areas for most of British Columbia. And you can sort of see the distribution in these three areas. I've just picked these three areas as highlights simply because the scale of this map is insufficient for you to actually see things. So you're looking at the northeast area, the Caribou and the Okanagan, and you can see the distribution of those stands that we would consider potentially capable of maintaining a persistent endemic population. But how much of that is actually potentially occupied? And remember, we intersected these stands that had the viable SDI only with those areas that actually had mountain pine beetle and by the time populations collapsed. And what's interesting is that we began, as I told you, with 1.2 million hectares or about 99,000 polygons, but then intersected them with where the mountain pine beetle had been during an outbreak. And what we found is that that's a lot less. In fact, the number of polygons drops to just over 68,000 or less than 1 million hectares. This is a consequence of the fact that mountain pine beetle is absent from large portions of the northernmost areas of British Columbia as a consequence of climatic unsuitability. So less than 2% of the pre-outbreak range now is likely got endemic mountain pine beetle capable of erupting. And this actually is something that suggests itself as a possible means of proactive management. And I'll come back to this in a slide or two down the way. But effectively, what we're saying here is that this gives us an ability to potentially target areas in a way that can actually limit the likelihood of there being a local source population for future eruptions. Now let's look at Alberta. Now, Alberta had a lot less pine at the start of the invasion, somewhat less than 5 million hectares. And you can see that when we consider how much of that is actually viable for endemic populations, there's lots of it. In fact, about 2.7 million hectares have SDI values currently that we expect to be viable for the mountain pine beetle. So there's a pretty big chunk of real estate available to the mountain pine beetle in Alberta remaining. In fact, over 50% of the pine that's out there. But if we begin to ask whether or not all of that endemic susceptible habitat is actually occupied by the beetle, this changes tremendously. Because, of course, the invasion itself has not gone everywhere. So remember, we had 2.7 million hectares of pine available. If we intersect that with where mountain pine beetle has expanded its range, we find that that actually drops off tremendously, just about 7,000 polygons, or about 98,000 hectares. I've done the same with this map as I did for British Columbia, and highlighting 3 areas for you to look at there. But you can see that this is a lot less than what we anticipated, about 2.5% of available habitat. So this is an indication that the unoccupied pine is either unsuitable or not yet available. These occupied polygons may be sources of future outbreaks and continued spread, which also remains a possible target for future management. So let's swing this around to management implications. So part of this actually is very suggestive in the context of Alberta, that continued efforts to mitigate spread are going to be pretty important, because the more you mitigate spread, the less real estate is available for occupation by these endemic populations, and the lower likelihood of eruption from a broader landscape. The recommendations from this suggest that for British Columbia, they should be out there targeting high SDI polygons in residual pine stands. They should remove them where merchantable, in my opinion, and where not, and where possible, perhaps modify them through a number of efforts that actually remove endemic susceptible trees. This can be achieved through thinning and spacing. It can be achieved through stand hygiene, a number of things that can actually be used to limit the likelihood of persistent bark beetle populations. In the context of Alberta, there's the same thing available in terms of targeting these residual stands with high SDI as a possibility of removing habitat for endemic beetles. And perhaps this isn't actually viable everywhere, but it certainly is in the western portions of the outbreak where populations have really initiated collapse, for example, Grand Prairie and Hinton regions. So let's think about some of the next steps that we want to do here. One of the things, and I did mention that we have reasonably good fit with our models, but not perhaps as good as we would like. We're explaining about 50% of the variation just using the vegetation inventories. Alberta has wall-to-wall LiDAR, and we would love to get our hands on that to test to see if we can actually improve our predictive capacity using it. There is the issue that post-collapse, that there's the possibility that there is continued range expansion by endemic beetles, very likely at a lower rate than what you get with epidemic beetles, but nonetheless, we need to consider range expansion. So the idea, as Mark sort of proposed this morning, in terms of looking at the possibility of these endemic beetles moving, is something we'd like to consider. And then ultimately, we want to get this out to see if any of these SDIs exist in the boreal forest as a possibility of support for endemic populations. And so we'll be looking out into the boreal forest to see if there's a possibility that volumes increase sufficiently to provide SDIs capable of supporting mountain pine beetle. And I did make mention, Keith asked about stuff going on to the east, and you can see from this image here that things are sparse across eastern Alberta, Saskatchewan, and even Manitoba, but Western Ontario has a fair volume of pine. And so it could have conditions capable of supporting endemic beetles if they were to get there, or if I was to ship them a box, if I'm running out of things to do. Or if Keith's going to his cabin, he can take some with him. So let me wrap a little bit with a few conclusions. So remember, the normative state for mountain pine beetle is this endemic state, the one where they're doing what effectively all the other bark beetles typically do, what we would call secondaries, and that is that they're focusing on trees that don't have any defensive capacity in them whatsoever. They are distinct in that context from epidemic populations that do something entirely different. Stand density index, I believe, is a very good proxy for endemic habitat suitability because it links so closely to those trees that are considered to be suitable for endemic populations. And it's a good indicator of where mountain pine beetle can exist and persist post-outbreak if mountain pine beetle occupies those regions. BC, there is some habitat remaining in the residual pine. Are we going to see mountain pine beetle outbreaks in British Columbia again? Perhaps regionally, localized, and perhaps in areas that are where they're persisting in these smaller regions. And I do know that Nadir was mentioning somewhere in Cranbrook, and I think one of my areas had a little bit of that area showing a fair amount of reasonable pine with SDI. Another region would be the Northwest. I know Celia Boone is the regional entomologist based out of Smithers, and she has got a bit of mountain pine beetle in her region right now. In Alberta, the potential endemic habitat remains widespread. And I think this is a really important point. I mean, we haven't had here the degree of mortality that they had in Alberta, and I don't think we're going to get it. I think that everything is in decline, and that's a good thing. It doesn't mean that things can't resurge, and that's also a high likelihood. The capacity to limit spread is going to limit the potential for persistent populations, and if spread can be limited, of course, there's less of an area to be concerned about from the point of view of local source populations for future eruptions. And so, effectively, this means that these areas might be amenable to proactive management if the outbreak fully collapses. And finally, targeted harvesting or modifications to stands that are intended to reduce endemic habitat will reduce the likelihood of localized future eruptions. And Keith is taking a photograph of that, and so I'll wait. And I'll say thank you once again to FRI Research, to the Government of Alberta, and in this case, the Government of BC for helping out this research. So thank you very much. Happy to take questions.